These borders are some of the most unusual ones in the world. In this video, I'm counting down 15 borders that zigzag for the most ridiculous reasons. Starting with number 15, the Northwest Angle. The Northwest Angle is the northernmost point of the contiguous United States, and it exists almost entirely because of a cartographic mistake. This small little wedge of land located in Minnesota is separated from the rest of the US by water and surrounded on three sides by Canada. The border here doesn't really follow logic, geography, or even culture. It follows a line that was drawn incorrectly on an 18th century map. Its origins trace back to the Treaty of Paris in 1783, which officially ended the American Revolutionary War. In defining this new border between the US and British North America, negotiators relied on inaccurate maps of the Great Lakes region. The treaty stated that the border would run from the Lake of the Woods to the most northwestern point thereof, and then due west to the Mississippi River. The problem is simple. The Mississippi River doesn't extend anywhere near the Lake of the Woods. At the time, the mapmakers believed it did, and the treaty language was based on this incorrect assumption. Rather than rewrite the entire agreement, later treaties attempted to salvage the situation. The Convention of 1818 established the border west of the Lake of Woods as the 49th parallel. However, the original treaty language still required identifying the lake's most northwestern point. Surveyors eventually determined that point and drew a vertical line south from it to the 49th parallel. The result was a small, isolated fragment of U.S. territory north of the parallel. That little fragment is the Northwest Angle. The border around it zigzags through water, it cuts through islands, and makes sharp directional changes that reflect legal wording rather than any physical reality. Today, it's got a year-round population of fewer than 200 people, and there's no direct land route from the angle to the rest of Minnesota without crossing into Canada. Residents have to either cross an international border twice by road or travel by boat across the Lake of the Woods. The boundary markers are maintained, and the line is surveyed to modern standard, and there's no dispute over ownership, only agreement that the situation is inconvenient. There's no folklore or hidden motive required. The zigzagging border here exists because early negotiators trusted a map that turned out to be wrong, and later governments chose legal continuity over geographic cleanup. This makes the Northwest Angle one of the clearest examples of how borders can bend, twist, and isolate communities simply because words were written before the land was fully understood. Number 14. Baarle. Baarle, it's one of the most fragmented borders on Earth, and it exists not because of a war or natural barriers, but because of medieval land deals that were never fully cleaned up. It's located on the border between Belgium and the Netherlands. Baarle consists of 22 Belgian enclaves entirely surrounded by the Netherlands, along with multiple Dutch counter-enclaves inside Belgian territory. The result is a border that cuts through streets, sidewalks, buildings, and even individual homes. The origins of this weird situation go back to the Middle Ages. In the 12th and 13th centuries, the land in this region was divided between local lords through a series of contracts, feudal rights, and property exchanges. Rather than defining continuous territories, these agreements often transferred specific parcels of land, farms, or revenue rights. When modern nation-states eventually formed, these medieval property arrangements were inherited rather than erased, and by the time Belgium became independent in 1830, the area around Baarle already consisted of a complex patchwork of ownership. Neither side wanted to give up that land that had long been considered legally theirs. The border was not fully clarified until the 20th century. In 1843, Belgium and the Netherlands signed the Treaty of Maastricht to define their boundary, but the Baarle region remained unresolved. Final clarification didn't happen until 1995, when both countries formally agreed on the exact placement of the border, not by simplifying it, but by locking in every historic parcel. As a result, the border zigzags constantly, sometimes changing direction within a few meters. In many cases, the border runs straight through buildings, and the nationality of a house is determined by the location of its front door. If the door opens on the Belgian side, the house is Belgian. If it opens on Dutch side, it's Dutch. All of this affects taxation, policing, business regulation, and even opening hours. For example, businesses historically took advantage of differing national laws by positioning entrances strategically. And despite all the complexity, though, the border is peaceful and cooperative. Both countries are members of the European Union and the Schengen area, which eliminates routine border checks. The local authorities coordinate closely, and residents often live their daily lives crossing international borders without even noticing. This zigzagging border is not the result of confusion or any modern era. It's the direct outcome of centuries-old legal agreements being respected in modern international law. Number 13. India-Bangladesh enclaves. Yeah, so for decades, the border between India and Bangladesh in the region around the Cooch Behar was one of the most fragmented borders ever recorded. Until 2015, this single stretch of boundary contained 162 enclaves, including enclaves within enclaves, producing border lines so irregular they defied normal governance. These enclaves were the remnants of agreements dating back to the 16th century, when the region was divided between the Kingdom of Cooch Behar and the Mughal Empire. Instead of drawing a continuous boundary, the two powers exchanged control of villages, land parcels, and revenue rights. These agreements were never intended to form modern borders, but they became frozen into place as political authority changed. When British India was partitioned in 1947, the border between India and what would become Bangladesh inherited this patchwork, almost unchanged. The enclaves weren't the result of confusion of independence, they were explicitly recognized, even though no practical solution existed at the time. At its most extreme, the border included Dahala Kagrabari, a tiny Indian enclave surrounded by Bangladeshi enclaves, which itself was inside India. This made it a third-order enclave, one of the rarest border situations ever documented, and all of that was legally recognized. Life inside these enclaves was exceptionally difficult. Residents often had no access to schools, healthcare, electricity, or paved roads because crossing the border required formal permission. Police jurisdiction, too, was unclear and infrastructure investment was minimal. Attempts to resolve the situation were discussed as early as the 1950s, but political disagreement prevented change for decades. Importantly, the situation persisted not because of any neglect, but because altering borders required constitutional amendments in India and parliamentary approval in Bangladesh. The issue, though, was finally resolved through the Land Boundary Agreement ratified in 2015. Under this agreement, India and Bangladesh exchanged enclaves, allowing residents to choose their citizenship. The border was simplified, but only after countries both formally agreed to undo centuries-old arrangements. Before 2015, the border's zigzagginess was entirely real and internationally recognized. It existed not because of geography or culture, but because feudal-era land deals were preserved far longer than anyone anticipated. This one shows how historical property rights can outlive empires and continue shaping modern borders in ways that appear absurd but are legally precise. Number 12. Gambia-Senegal border. The border between the Gambia and Senegal is one of the narrowest and really weirdest international boundaries. The Gambia is a long, thin country that follows the Gambia River inland from the Atlantic Ocean, surrounded almost entirely by Senegal. This border exists almost entirely due to European agreements rather than local geography or ethnic boundaries. During the 18th and 19th century, Britain and France competed for control of trade routes in West Africa. Britain focused on the navigable portion of the Gambia River, while France controlled the surrounding territory that would become Senegal. Rather than fight over the interior, the two powers negotiated. Britain retained control of the river corridor to facilitate trade and access inland, while France retained the surrounding land. The result was a country defined not by watersheds or populations, but by the reach of the river navigation. These borders were formalized through treaties in 1889 and 1904. They defined the Gambia's territory as extending a fixed distance from each bank of the river. This created that long ribbon-like country whose borders bend and shift. And while the river itself meanders, the political border doesn't always follow its exact course. In some sections, straight-line segments were drawn to maintain consistent width. In others, the border shifts to accommodate settlements or colonial-era survey lines. When the Gambia gained independence in 1965, it inherited this border intact. There was no serious attempt to redraw it despite its impracticality. Senegal and the Gambia have since cooperated politically and economically, but the border remains unchanged. Today, it affects transportation, trade, and national identity. Roads crossing the Gambia require multiple border checks when traveling through Senegal. But despite that, the boundary is stable and undisputed. This one ranks here because its shape looks absurd on a map, yet every bend is the direct result of treaties designed to control a single river. The zigzag is not chaos, it's logic preserved in modern form. Number 11. Kentucky Bend. Kentucky Bend is a small, isolated piece of the state of Kentucky that's completely surrounded by Tennessee and Missouri. It exists not because of a settlement pattern or political compromise, but because a river changed course after a border was legally fixed. The result is a border that loops, twists, and encloses a pocket of land in a way that looks accidental, but it's entirely lawful. The origins of the Kentucky Bend go back to the late 18th century, when state boundaries in the U.S. were often defined using rivers. In this case, the Mississippi River was chosen as the western boundary of Kentucky. At the time, the river's course formed a large looping meander that curved sharply east before flowing south again. When Kentucky became a state in 1792, its boundary was legally defined as following the Mississippi River as it existed at that moment. Now that's the crucial point. The border followed the river's channel, not a fixed latitude or longitude. No one involved anticipated that the river itself would later move. Over time, the Mississippi changed course through a natural process of erosion and deposition. In the early 19th century, the river cut a new, straighter channel across the neck of the meander. This type of change is known as an avulsion. It occurs when a river suddenly abandons one channel for another. And importantly, under U.S. law, borders defined by rivers do not automatically move when an avulsion occurs. As a result, the old river channel remained the legal border, even though it no longer carried the river's main flow. The Kentucky Bend is only accessible by land through Tennessee, and there's no direct road connection to the rest of Kentucky. The area is sparsely populated, with farmland making up most of the territory. On a map, it appears as a bubble or a hook that extends into Tennessee, completely detached from Kentucky's main body. It's not a surveying error or a compromise, it is the direct result of legal definitions. There have been no serious efforts to redraw the boundary. Doing so would require interstate agreements and congressional approval, and there's been little practical incentive to do that. The border, while awkward, is stable and undisputed. This one earns a place on this list because it looks irrational, but it's completely consistent with all the legal principles. The Mississippi moved, the border didn't, and the result is one of the strangest internal boundaries in the United States. Number 10. The Caprivi Strip. The Caprivi Strip is a long, narrow extension of Namibia that stretches eastwards for more than 450 kilometers between Angola, Botswana, and Zambia. Its shape is so unusual that it's often described as the Panhandle. The borders zigzag and bend repeatedly, not because of a terrain or population, but because of colonial-era assumptions that turned out to be wrong. The strip was created in the late 19th century during the period known as the Scramble for Africa. In 1890, Germany and Britain signed the Heligoland-Zanzibar Treaty, which redistributed any colonial claim. Germany controlled what was then German Southwest Africa, now Namibia, and Britain controlled territories to the east. Germany wanted access to the Zambezi River, believing it would provide a navigable trade route to the Indian Ocean. Britain agreed to grant Germany a narrow corridor of land extending east from Namibia towards the river, and that corridor became the Caprivi Strip, named after German Chancellor Leo von Caprivi. On paper, the deal made sense. On the ground, it didn't. The Zambezi River is not navigable from this region to the sea due to Victoria Falls, which lies downstream. This fact was either unknown or underestimated by the European negotiators at the time, and as a result, the corridor failed to provide the commercial access Germany expected. The northern boundary follows rivers and straight-line segments negotiated with Portugal, which controlled Angola. The southern boundary was defined in relation to the British-controlled Bechuanaland, now Botswana, and the eastern end narrows and bends to avoid overlapping claims near the Zambezi. The result is a border that changes directions multiple times, creating these sharp angles and narrow choke points. In some places, the strip is less than 50 kilometers wide, and its shape reflects diplomatic compromise. After World War I, Namibia came under South African administration, but the Caprivi Strip remained part of the territory, and when Namibia gained independence in 1990, it inherited the strip intact. The Caprivi Strip shows how colonial-era decisions made with limited information can permanently distort national borders. Every bend, though, is documented and every angle is intentional, and the result still shapes southern Africa today. Number 9. Bir Tawil. Bir Tawil is one of the only places on the planet that's claimed by no country, and the reason it exists is because two borders were drawn differently at different times. It is a direct consequence of two legally valid but incompatible boundary definitions. The situation originates from British administration of Egypt and Sudan in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. In 1899, Britain established a political boundary between Egypt and Sudan along the 22nd parallel north. This was intended to be a simple, straight-line border running east to west across the desert. However, in 1902, British administrators introduced a second boundary for administrative convenience. This new line adjusted control of certain areas based on tribal movements and ease of governance. Under this arrangement, the Halaib Triangle, a coastal region on the Red Sea, was placed under Sudanese administration, while Bir Tawil, a landlocked desert area south of the 22nd parallel, was administered as part of Egypt. When Sudan became independent in 1956, the two countries faced a choice. If Egypt claimed the 1899 border, it would gain Bir Tawil, but lose Halaib. If the Sudan claimed the 1902 border, it would gain Halaib, but lose Bir Tawil. Both countries chose the border interpretation that gave them Halaib, which is larger, coastal, and economically viable. As a result, neither country claims Bir Tawil. This creates a very rare situation in international law known as terra nullius, meaning land claimed by no sovereign state. Bir Tawil covers about 2,000 square kilometers, making it larger than some small countries. Despite its size, though, it's uninhabited, extremely arid, and lacks any known natural resources. On maps, you can see a strange double line effect, where Egypt and Sudan agree on one border in one area and disagree in another. The zigzag isn't the result of confusion or oversight. It is the product of two clearly legal positions that can't both be satisfied. And occasionally, private individuals have attempted to symbolically claim Bir Tawil, but these actions have no legal standing. International law does not recognize claims made without state authority, and neither Egypt nor Sudan has altered its position. The zigzag is not shaped by rivers, mountains, or settlements, but by mutually exclusive treaty interpretations. And the result is one of the strangest borders on Earth. Number 8. Botswana-Zambia border. The border between Botswana and Zambia is one of the shortest international borders, measuring only about 150 meters. It exists as a tiny zigzag between four countries, Botswana, Zambia, Namibia, and Zimbabwe, and it was drawn specifically to avoid a four-country intersection known as a quadrupoint. The situation is centered around the town of Kazungula, where the Zambezi River meets the Chobe River. In this area, colonial-era borders brought four territories extremely close together. However, international law generally avoids quadrupoints because they complicate border management and jurisdiction. To prevent this, Britain, which controls several of the territories involved, defined the border so that Botswana and Zambia would share a narrow strip of river boundary. This ensured that only two countries met at any single point, even though the separation is barely visible on the ground. The result is a border that bends sharply within the river, forming a short diagonal connection between Botswana and Zambia. And on a map, it looks almost like a mistake, but it is carefully drawn and legally recognized. While some popular sources claim there was once a true quadrupoint there, official maps and legal documents consistently show the Botswana-Zambia border segment. The governments involved recognize it, and it's been used in infrastructure planning. For decades, this short border was crossed by ferry. In 2021, the Kazungula Bridge officially opened, directly connecting Botswana and Zambia. The zigzag here is subtle but important. It exists only really to satisfy legal definitions and not geography. It earns its place on this list because it shows how international boundaries can bend dramatically over extremely small distances to solve a legal problem. Moving on to number 7, Llívia. Llívia is a Spanish town completely surrounded by France, and it exists because of a single word in a 17th century treaty. The border here zigzags not because of geography or rivers, but because of how town and village were defined more than 350 years ago. The origin of Llívia dates back to the Treaty of the Pyrenees, signed in 1659 between France and Spain. This treaty ended a long war and transferred territory from Spain to France. Under its terms, Spain ceded 33 villages in the Cerdagne region of France. However, Llívia was not included in that transfer because it was legally classified as a town, not a village. That distinction mattered, and at the time, Llívia held a royal charter granting it town status. Because the treaty listed only villages by name, Llívia remained Spanish territory, even though the surrounding settlement became French. No attempt was made to redraw the border more cleanly, and the legal wording was followed exactly. The result is a Spanish exclave covering about 12 square kilometers, entirely enclosed by France. To connect Llívia to the rest of Spain, a narrow road was later established. This road crosses French territory, but it's governed by agreements that allow uninterrupted access. For centuries, this corridor was a source of dispute, especially regarding customs enforcement and policing. Today, because both countries are in the Schengen area, the border is largely invisible in daily life. The border is not symbolic. Jurisdiction changes immediately when crossing it. Laws, taxation, administration, they all differ, even though the landscape doesn't. Emergency services, schooling, and governance all operate under Spanish authority inside the exclave. Importantly, though, there's no disagreement between France and Spain over it. Its status has been reaffirmed through multiple treaties and agreements since 1659. The zigzag border persists because no government has chosen to alter a legally settled outcome. A single legal classification froze a medieval distinction into a modern international anomaly. Number 6. Point Roberts. Point Roberts is a small U.S. community that's physically attached to Canada and cut off from the rest of the United States. It exists because of a straight line drawn across a map without regards for coastlines, peninsulas, or settlements. The border here follows the 49th parallel north, which was established as the boundary between British North America and the United States under the Oregon Treaty of 1846. This treaty extended the 49th parallel westward from the Rocky Mountains to the Pacific Ocean. On paper, the solution was elegant. On the ground, it created a problem. The 49th parallel slices directly across the Tsawwassen Peninsula, leaving its southern tip, Point Roberts, south of the line. That tip became U.S. territory, even though it's connected by land only to Canada. There was no adjustment made to account for the geography. The line was followed precisely. As a result, Point Roberts is an American exclave of about 5 square miles, accessible by land only through Canada, and residents have to cross an international border to reach the rest of Washington state, either by driving through British Columbia or by boat. The border around it is unusually sharp. It cuts across beaches, neighborhoods, and roads in a perfectly straight east-west line. In some places, the border runs directly through residential streets with houses on one side in the United States and the other in Canada. But the community has existed under this arrangement since the mid-19th century, so its population fluctuates seasonally, with many residents owning vacation homes. But despite its impracticality, the border has never been seriously challenged. Redrawing it would require renegotiating a major international treaty, and both countries have instead chosen to manage the consequences rather than alter the line. Point Roberts did become widely known during the COVID-19 pandemic when the border restrictions severely limited the residents' ability to travel, and this showed how dependent the exclave is on cross-border cooperation. The zigzag here is not curved or irregular, it's rigidly straight, and that's exactly the problem. The border ignores geography entirely, cutting cleanly across land that was never meant to be divided this way. The zigzag is minimal, but the consequences are extreme. Number 5. The Derby Line-Stanstead border. The border between Derby Line, Vermont and Stanstead, Quebec is one of the most literal examples of a zigzagging boundary because it cuts directly through buildings, streets, and sidewalks. And the reason is not conflict or confusion, but a commitment to a straight line drawn long before the town developed around it. This section of the U.S.-Canada border follows the 45th parallel north, as defined by a series of treaties, beginning with the Treaty of Paris in 1783, and later clarified by surveys in the 19th century. The intention was to create a clean, geometric boundary, but what no one anticipated was that communities would later grow directly on top of that line. It originally developed as a single cross-border community. Streets, utilities, and buildings were constructed without regard to the international boundary because for much of their early history, the border had little practical effect on daily life. Customs enforcement was minimal, and movement across the line was common. The most famous structure here is the Haskell Free Library and Opera House, built in 1904. The building was intentionally placed on the border as a symbol of cooperation. A black line running across the floor marks the exact international boundary. On one half, the building is United States, the other is in Canada. The main entrance is on the US side, while much of the reading room is in Canada. It's not symbolic either. Jurisdiction changes as soon as the line is crossed. Canadian police have the authority on one side of the room and US police the other. The legal agreements allow the building to function normally, but the visitors are required to follow specific entry and exit rules to avoid technically crossing the border illegally. Elsewhere in the town, the border cuts directly through some residential streets, and in some cases the line runs down the center of a road with houses on one side in Vermont and other houses in Quebec. And in other cases, buildings straddle the boundary, requiring detailed legal arrangements to determine taxation and emergency services. In the 20th and 21st centuries, increased border enforcement has made the arrangement a bit more complicated. After the September 11th attacks and during later security changes, informal crossing became restricted. Residents now respect the boundary precisely, even in places where it cuts through what looks like a single neighborhood. But despite the challenges, the border remains unchanged. Both countries recognize the line exactly as surveyed. There's been no serious effort to relocate it or simplify it, because doing so would require reopening a long-settled treaty definition. The zigzag's not in the treaty, it's just created by life adapting to a line that refused to move. Number 4. Croatia-Serbia border. The border between Croatia and Serbia along the Danube River is one of the most visibly zigzagging borders in Europe, and it exists because the river does not stay where it was when the borders were drawn. Unlike many river borders that shift naturally over time, this one is frozen to two different interpretations of history. The Danube has always been a dynamic river, changing course through erosion, flooding, and sediment deposition. Over the centuries, it meanders and it's moved laterally across the floodplain. When borders were first defined in this region during the Austro-Hungarian period, the river's course was used as a convenient boundary. The problem arose when Yugoslavia dissolved in the 1990s. Croatia argues that the border should follow the historical boundaries established during the Austro-Hungarian era. These boundaries were fixed to land ownership records, not the current river channel. Serbia, by contrast, argues that the border should follow the present-day center line of the Danube and is common in international river borders. Because the Danube has shifted so much since those maps were created, the two interpretations produce very different borders. Croatia's claimed border zigzags around sharply, cutting across the river, looping around islands, and sometimes placing Croatian territory on the Serbian side of the current river channel. The result has been a patchwork of disputed areas totaling roughly 140 square kilometers. Some sections consist of uninhabited river islands and floodplain land. Others affect navigation, agriculture, and local jurisdiction. Importantly, though, the areas are not lawless. They're simply claimed differently by the two states. You can clearly see this on maps. In some stretches, the border follows long, angular lines that ignore the river's flow. In others, it jumps around abruptly from one bank to the other. That's not due to poor mapping, but to two legally coherent, yet incompatible boundary principles. But despite the dispute, the situation has remained largely peaceful. Both countries patrol their claimed areas but avoid any escalation. The border's not fully demarcated on the ground, and negotiations have continued intermittently, including discussions about arbitration. This one ranks high because it shows how rivers can create extreme border irregularities when legal definitions lag behind the physical reality. It is the visible scar left by a river that moved, while borders refuse to agree on how to move with it. Number 3. The Vennbahn Railway. The Vennbahn is one of the most unusual borders in Europe because it's not a river, ridge, or straight line, it's a railway line. The border zigzags repeatedly through western Germany and eastern Belgium, creating a series of German enclaves entirely surrounded by Belgian territory. The reason is simple and well documented. After World War I, sovereignty followed the railway, not the land around it. The Vennbahn Railway was built in the late 19th century to connect Aachen in Germany with Luxembourg. At the time, it ran entirely through German territory. After Germany's defeat in World War I, the Treaty of Versailles in 1919 transferred several border regions to Belgium, including control of the Vennbahn railway corridor. Crucially, Belgium didn't just gain the right to operate the railway, it gained sovereignty over the railway land itself, including the track bed and the surroundings. The land on either side, however, remained German. This decision instantly created a fragmented border. As the railway crossed back and forth through the region, it carved Belgian territory into German land, isolating small pockets of Germany on the opposite side. These pockets became the German enclaves surrounded by Belgium, even though they were only meters away from the rest of Germany. At its peak, though, the Vennbahn created 5 German enclaves, some consisting of only a handful of houses or fields. The border does zigzag sharply wherever the railway curves, producing these angles and loops that make little geographic sense but reflect the physical path of the track. This does have legal consequences. Property ownership, policing, and jurisdiction change when crossing what appear to be an abandoned rail trail. Boundary markers still define the land there, and maps reflect the zigzag precisely. Belgium and Germany have cooperated extensively to manage this situation, and the enclaves have caused few serious disputes. However, the border has never been simplified. Altering it would require renegotiating post-war treaties that both countries prefer to leave untouched. A single railway, built for transportation, becoming a sovereign boundary that fragmented a territory for a century. This one's not symbolic, it's the legal footprint of steel tracks that once carried trains across Europe. Number 2. Belgium-Netherlands Meuse border. The border between Belgium and the Netherlands along the Meuse River is an example of how borders can zigzag when rivers move but legal boundaries don't keep up. For decades, this stretch of border produced enclaves, isolated land parcels, and jurisdictional confusion, all because the river changed course while the border stayed frozen. The original border along the Meuse was defined in the 19th century, when the river's center line was used as the boundary between the two countries. At the time, this did make sense. Rivers were visible, natural dividing lines, and surveying technology was pretty limited. Over time, though, the Meuse was engineered. Straightening projects, canals, flood control efforts all altered the river's course, especially in the 20th century. New channels were dug, bends were cut off, and old meanders became isolated oxbow lakes. The border, though, remained fixed to the old river path, not the new one. This created a situation where pieces of Belgium lay on the Dutch side of the river and vice versa. In some cases, land could only be accessed by crossing into the other country. Police jurisdiction, of course, became complicated, and emergency response and land management were inefficient. On maps, you can clearly see the boundary looks tangled, especially near towns like IJsden and Maastricht. Unlike many disputed borders, though, this one's not contentious. Both Belgium and the Netherlands agreed on the cause and the problem. The difficulty was legal, not political. Changing the border required formal treaties and parliamentary approval. So in 2016, the two countries signed an agreement to simplify the border. Under the New Deal, territories were exchanged so the border would follow the current river channel rather than the abandoned one. That agreement came into force in 2018. Even today, historical maps and boundary stones show the former border complexity clearly. And this one ranks near the top because it shows how even peaceful, cooperative countries can end up with absurd boundaries simply by letting infrastructure and nature change while the law stands still. Number 1. The United States-Mexico-Rio Grande border. The border between the United States and Mexico along the Rio Grande River is the most zigzagging, legally complicated, and persistent problematic border in the modern world. It twists, doubles back on itself, it loops, and creates isolated pockets of land, not because of poor planning or political indecision, but because the border is tied to a river that refuses to stay still. This border exists because of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, signed in 1848 at the end of the Mexican-American War. Under the treaty, the Rio Grande was established as the boundary between Texas and Mexico, and at the time, using a river as a border seemed practical and uncontroversial. What no treaty can control, though, is how rivers behave. The Rio Grande is a highly dynamic river. It naturally meanders across its floodplain, eroding banks on one side and depositing sediment on the other. International law distinguishes between two types of river movement: accretion, which is slow natural shifts in the river's course, and avulsion, sudden changes like when a river cuts a new channel during a flood. That distinction's critical here. Under long-established legal doctrine, borders move with the river if the change is gradual accretion, but do not move if the change is a sudden avulsion. That rule does sound simple, but applying it to a real river is anything but. As a result, the US-Mexico border along the Rio Grande became a legal maze. Over time, the river created hundreds of extreme bends, and this produced isolated land parcels known as a bank shift and tract, some of which could only be accessed by crossing into the other country. One of the most famous examples is the Horcon Tract near present-day Rio Grande City in Texas. In 1906, the river was artificially diverted as part of an irrigation project, creating a sudden avulsion. The land south of the new channel became physically attached to Mexico, but legally remained part of the United States. For decades, the Horcon Tract existed in this weird state. It was legally U.S. territory but administered by Mexico. The situation persisted until 1970 when the U.S. formally transferred the tract to Mexico through the Boundary Treaty of 1970, acknowledging the reality created by the river. Another major flashpoint was the Chamizal dispute, involving land between El Paso, Texas and Ciudad Juarez in Mexico. In the mid-19th century, the Rio Grande gradually shifted south through accretion. The United States argued that the border should move with the river. Mexico argued that the change was an avulsion and the border should remain in its original position. Both sides did have legal arguments supported by surveys and hydrological analysis. This dispute lasted more than 100 years. During that time, the border zigzagged through neighborhoods and farmland. Jurisdiction was unclear and development stalled. The Chamizal dispute was finally resolved in 1963 when the U.S. agreed to return most of the contested land to Mexico. The river was then artificially straightened and channelized to prevent any future movement in that section. To manage all this chaos, the International Boundary and Water Commission was created. This joint U.S.-Mexico body oversees the river, manages flood control, and resolves dispute. Even with this institution in place, though, the border remains one of the most complex. In many areas, the legal border no longer aligns with the visible river at all, and it may cut across dry land and follow abandoned channels, or loop around areas that look entirely misplaced on a map. Unlike many other borders on this list, the Rio Grande one is still changing. Engineering projects have stabilized parts of it, but natural forces continue to test that boundary. Every shift requires legal interpretation, bilateral agreement, and physical marking. And this is why it's number one, because no other border combines a constantly moving natural feature, rigid legal doctrine, century-long international disputes, physically isolated territories, and repeated engineered fixes that create new problems. These zigzags here are not cosmetic. They shape sovereignty, law enforcement, and land ownership, relations across nearly 2,000 square kilometers. The Rio Grande border is the clearest example of what happens when a political line is tied to a living, shifting landscape, and then forced to obey rules written as if the land would stay still.